The Lord be with you. As you know, we are in the wilderness. At least that's where some of us feel that we are. In particular, members of the so-called mainline churches faced with declining membership, aging congregations. But in general, I think, young people, Christian young people, are experiencing a kind of crisis of identity owing to the captivity of the public profile of what it means to be a Christian. And some of us may feel as if the moral values that we grew up with are being eroded by our public discourse. And in particular, here in Dayton, according to Frontline, a city that has been what? Left behind. We may feel as if we are in the wilderness. But what we discovered beginning last week is that the wilderness has lessons to teach. In the biblical tradition, the people of God are frequently in the wilderness, called there by God, driven there by the Spirit, wandering there in search of what has been promised, protected there from beastly, even demonic forces. So that's the idea behind our work together this semester, that we are in the wilderness. And what we want to do is to learn for ourselves the lessons that the wilderness has to teach. Last week we started off with Israel in the wilderness. The wilderness generation described in the book of Exodus and Numbers. And we focused in particular on Paul's midrash on the wilderness generation in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul wrote that letter to Christ believers in one of the glittering new cities of the Mediterranean, Corinth, a city where some people amassed staggering fortunes, and others lived right at the edge of subsistence. A city which in Paul's day had become the center of the slave trade in the Mediterranean. The North Market at Corinth is where human beings were bought and sold. It was a city famous for sexual immorality. The great Roman geographer Strabo tells us that prostitution was thriving in the city of Corinth and was one of the reasons that the city grew rich. And so, faced with a lot of temptations and surrounded by the glittering veil of money and power, Paul wrote to these Corinthian believers in Christ, people who had responded at first to his message, the message that God had extracted the life of the crucified Jesus from the dead place, the mortal site to which it had been assigned by the continuum of Roman power, that God had broken that continuum. And people responded to that. Let me put it this way. They woke up in the middle of their lives. And they began to become the agents, the subjects of their own lives. But then came the pressures, the temptations, the conflicts, the temptation of idolatry, the temptation to go along in order to fit in, the lure of pornography. Porneia is Paul's word for it. And so Paul writes a word of admonition. Last week we discovered that the Greek word that Paul uses for what he is offering the Corinthians is the word nouthesia. You remember what that means? It is something that he is placing in their minds. The Greek word is nous, means mind. He's placing something there. And what he is placing is a tupos. Do you remember what a tupos is? It's the image that is left when the die strikes the coin. It's the image on the ground that is left when the hoof of a horse goes down into the dust. So the story of Israel, the wilderness generation, is more than just an example for the Corinthians. It's a model, it's a mold in which they are encouraged to see their own experience, to put something in their minds that will enable them to hold out, to hold on, to survive in the city where they found themselves called. Now, last week, we worked our way through this rich and fascinating text. A text that I'm now working on with you all for the first time in any detail. And I have to admit, I'm just amazed at how insightful Paul is at this point. And we worked our way down, you remember, to chapter 10, verse 6, where Paul says that the thing that kept the people of Israel captive, that kept them in bondage, was their own craving. Do you remember that? The Greek word epithumia, which is a desire always for more, excess. Sometimes it's translated lust. It's that craving. And drawing upon, Bruce, the work of a University of Chicago professor, a psychologist, a philosopher, he's one of my favorites at the moment. His name is Eric Santner. And Chuck, I don't know if you've come across him, but he has a book called On the Psychotheology of Everyday Life. A little book, I love it. And he works with the theories of Sigmund Freud and the inspirational writings of Franz Rosenzweig, but he also draws on St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a profound psychologist. And according to Augustine, the problem with human beings, Augustine describes, is that we are incurvatus a se. We are curved or turned back upon what? Ourselves. So this desire, this craving that Paul talks about is a selfish desire that turns us back upon ourselves and in the process shuts us off from life, from the gracious God who gives us this beautiful world around us, who gives not only food, manna, an ancient version, I guess, of cream of wheat, but who also gives the Oktoberfest, right? Bratwurst and so much else. So we are shut off from God's gracious provision. We're shut off from the people who need us. Each one of us driven to satisfy our excessive cravings and turned back upon ourselves. That turning toward ourselves is ultimately a turning away from others and a turning away from what Eric Santner calls the big other, the divine, from God. Now, I told you we would pick it up at this point today and watch what happens next. Beginning in chapter 10, verse 7, Paul identifies our cravings as falling into three categories. The three primal cravings. Number one, idolatria. Can you figure out what that is? Idolatry. Literally, it is the service of images, the service of idols. And then, the second craving is porneia, sexual immorality, the desire to draw to ourselves for our own gratification the persons of others. And finally, and this is the most interesting one, I think, and it may surprise you, the Greek word is gongunizo. Do you remember what I said that means? Grumbling. Complaining. And we're going to dig in. We're going to dig into that in just a minute and figure out why is grumbling, complaining, according to Paul, one of the three primal cravings. But let's start where Paul starts, with idolatria. He says to the Corinthians, do not become idolaters, as some of them were, the people of Israel, as it is written. And then he quotes one verse from Exodus. Quote, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. Now, first the concept, idolatria, the service of images, the service of idols. In other words, I think this is so profound of Paul. The images of our cravings, our selfishness, that we project outside ourselves, that we objectify, our objectified desires, we eventually come to serve those things. In other words, paradoxically, we lose ourselves to what? Idols, to images, to projections of our selfishness. And in the process, we lose what? Our freedom. Yeah, we come to be in bondage, in service to those things. The story to which Paul alludes and from which he quotes one verse here of what happened to the wilderness generation perfectly illustrates the psycho-spiritual process of the projection of desire and the loss of self, bondage to it. You know the story from Exodus 32. Moses was where? Up on the mountain. Receiving what? The Ten Commandments. Yeah. The law that would eventually lead to the creation of a righteous people. And in his absence, the people said, when Moses was delayed in coming down the mountain, they said, "Come, let us make gods for ourselves. Right, you know the story.
Yes.
And as for Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And so Aaron, the brother of Moses, says to them what? Take off the rings, the jewelry, the earrings, the rings on the fingers of your wives, your sons, that's interesting, and your daughters, and bring them to me. And so all the people took off their gold. Isn't this a perfect narrative version of the externalization, the objectification of craving, of desire? They take off those rings, they alienate them from themselves, right? I mean, I would never take off my wedding ring. That my wife, I didn't even take it off when I had surgery. That was because I couldn't get it off. I've gained a little bit of weight, right, since I was 22 years old. But I would never part with it. I mean, that's the sign of my bond, my trust, my love. But look what the people do. They take off the things that they might have been given by their grandmother or their husband or their wife. And they bring it to Aaron. And what did Aaron do? He took the gold and he melted it down and poured it into a mold and cast it into what? The image of a calf. The kind of gods, the animal gods that were worshipped by the Egyptians. You see that they have formed an image of what? Their own bondage. The Israelites in Egypt were what? Slaves. They weren't a free people. They're worshiping the god of their own slavery. And the people shouted out. They said, "These are our gods, O Israel. These are the ones who brought us out of the land of Egypt." Look how perverted. The world is turned completely backwards. It was those golden cravings that kept them in Egypt, that started off as compliance and then became what? Did we say last week? Complacency, and finally, for some, complicity. And now they're so turned around in their minds that they think that these images of their own desires are the gods that led them out of Egypt. It's just the opposite. Walter Brueggemann, the great Old Testament scholar who has worked a lot on the story of the Exodus, do you know how he puts it? He says the terrible fate of the Israelites in the wilderness, and a fate that he thinks we still suffer from today, is that they had Pharaoh in the soul. Pharaoh in the soul. Eric Santner describes the condition as Egyptomania. Right? So captured by the objects of our desires. So when Aaron saw this, the text says, he built an altar in front of the animal. And he said, tomorrow, this is how perverted it is. Aaron says, tomorrow will be a festival to Yahweh, the Lord. You see, driven by our cravings, externalizing those desires, and then sacrificing ourselves to them, we become so perverted in our thinking that we think of idolatry as what? Worship of God. See, we develop a secondary justification for our cravings. Oh, we're doing this for the greater glory of God. And so they rose early the next day And they offered burnt offerings, and they brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people, this is the verse Paul quotes, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. They rose up to revel. Now, the three things that they did here, sitting down to eat and drink, of course, that is very relevant to the situation of Christ believers at Corinth, who, as we discovered last week, had received invitations from their pagan friends to dine where? In the banquet halls of pagan temples, like the god Asclepius. But what about that verb, to play? They rose up to play. The Greek verb is paisein. Can you say that with me? Paisein. And it means to play, it means to dance, but watch this. At the root of that word is the Greek word pais. Does anyone know what pais means? Child. It's the Greek word for a child. And what Paul is suggesting is that Israel needed in the wilderness, this takes us toward one of our lessons of the wilderness, Israel was behaving immaturely. They were behaving like children, and what they needed was what?
Discipline.
To grow up. They needed lessons. They needed parental help. And so one of the lessons of the wilderness, Paul is already signaling, foreshadowing, that the wilderness could be a place to grow up. But how do we grow up? Chapter 10, verse 8. Paul says, neither should we practice sexual immorality, porneia, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Do you know this story? It's from Numbers, chapter 25. And what happens is that there was a prophet of Baal of Peor. His name was Balaam. You remember him?
Yes.
And he leads Israel into disaster, into sin. Do you remember how he does it? He brings prostitutes into the Hebrew camp. Women of Moab and of Midian. He brings in prostitutes, and the people of Israel cannot resist their craving, the desire to satisfy a selfish lust on the body of a human being that has been placed at their disposal. 23,000 died in a single day, says Numbers chapter 26. Do you know why they died? Plague, disease spread through the camp. Now, of course, we don't have a problem with this, do we? Right? One thing that the Me Too movement has taught us is what? How absolutely common sexual imposition is. And why is it that so many men feel that they can satisfy their craving on what? The body of another person. Female or male. Even if they're not interested in it, right? Even if they reject the advances. Why is that? How does that craving lead so many people? Look at all of the people in the past couple of months that have what? Fallen in public esteem, fallen from grace, lost their careers, completely discredited because they couldn't resist the craving. Next verse, chapter 10, verse 9. Let us not test or tempt Christ, as some of them did, and they were destroyed by serpents. Now, I need to tell you that some of the Greek manuscripts here, and if you have a Greek Bible, you can see which ones down in the footnotes. See, every page has a whole bunch of footnotes at the bottom. And that shows you the different manuscript readings. A great many manuscripts say, "Let us not tempt God or the Lord," rather than Christ. And the great interpreter of Scripture, John Chrysostom, also says that the text read God or the Lord. Do you recognize the story that Paul is alluding to here? It is Numbers chapter 21. Because of a lack of food and drink, or at least a felt lack, the Israelites begin to complain against God. They go to Moses, but the complaint is really about what? God. What God is providing. It's not enough. There's not enough diversity in that manna. And the Greek verb here is the verb peirazein. This is what they do. It means to test or to complain. The whole incident that Paul is alluding to, I think, is clarified by one of the Psalms. Psalm chapter 77, verse 18, quote, listen to this, "And they tested God in their hearts by demanding food for their selfish desires." Now, the Greek is very revealing here. The Septuagint translation of that psalm adds the selfish desires that were in their souls. In other words, their bodies were being what? Fed, nourished, even if it was sort of boring. But in their souls, there was what? A craving, a selfish desire for more. You know, I found myself battling it yesterday. I had a perfectly good pork chop at the Oktoberfest, but I just couldn't resist having a bratwurst. More! Diane had one, and because I saw her eating it, in my soul, even though I had no more room in my body, so I woke up all night long last night because of my selfish craving. And as punishment, if you remember the story, God sends poisonous serpents among the people. And Moses comes to the help of the Israelite people. He fashions a bronze image of what? A serpent. And he lifts it up on a pole. And whoever is bitten and looks on that serpent, what? Lives. Now, again, to me, the stories are so psychologically profound. The only way that they can live is by confronting, by looking at what?
What makes them ill?
The thing that made them ill. Exactly. By looking at the thing that made them ill is by confronting. Honestly confronting. The stories are so profound. Chapter 10, verse 10. Now we come to the grumbling. Do not grumble, as some of them grumbled, and they were killed by the destroyer. You can hear, even in English, in the English translation, that the Greek verb gongutsein, can I write this up here? Gongutsein. Can you say that with me? Gongutsein. The Greek verb is repeated by Paul for emphasis. He wants people to think about grumbling. And they grumbled, Paul says. And he equates this grumbling This is a verb, by the way, that is onomatopoetic. It sounds like what it is, doesn't it? Gonguse. When you look this verb up in the Greek dictionary, do you know what it is? It's described as a very quiet, mumbling or talking to oneself. It's not communication with whom? Others. It's not prayer. It's not conversation. It's not dialogue. It's what?
A muttering of self-contradiction.
Yes, muttering to yourself. A quiet talking to yourself. And do you know the story to which Paul is alluding here? It's Numbers chapter 14. And I have to tell you this story. So the people of Israel have made it from Egypt all the way to the edge of the Promised Land. And spies are sent out to look over the land. And all of the spies except for two, Joshua and Caleb, thank you. All of the spies except for those two come back and they say what? We can't do it. There are what? Giants. The Greek word is Nephilim. There are giants in the land. And we have no hope of entering the land of promise. Do you remember what they say? They say, in comparison with those giants, we are just what? Grasshoppers. Thank you. We're just little grasshoppers in their sight. And listen to this. This is the text that Paul is referring to. And all the Israelites grumbled. They all talked to themselves a little bit. And listen to what they said. They said, would that we had died in Egypt. Or would that we have died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become booty. Would it not have been better to go back to Egypt? And so they said to one another, let us choose a captain who will lead us back where? Egypt. Well, these are stories that, formed my childhood. My father read them at night, but I have to tell you, they resonate with my adult experience. For some years, I was a faculty member at United Theological Seminary here in Dayton. And I even had the joy and the pleasure of serving as the Dean of Doctoral Studies. Our Doctoral Studies program at United Seminary, for a time, was the premier place for African American pastors to receive an education. And the great pastors and preachers across the country today got their Doctor of Ministry degrees at United. In other words, we walked as a school right up to the edge, to the border of what? The Promised Land of racial relations. Right? Our most difficult problem in this country, as a legacy of slavery and the Civil War, our deepest dilemma is the problem of race, I think. And at United Seminary, we walked right up to the border of the Promised Land. We had all these African American mentors who were setting the world on fire. People like Samuel Proctor, who spoke so deeply to the heart. We even had an African American vice president of the institution. And then guess what? As an institution, well, as one of our professors in the program said, we turned around and went back into the wilderness. We retreated from the Promised Land. And we appointed a president who made the seminary more and more white. We lost most of our African American mentors. Maybe it was that we were afraid of where God was leading us, that we might lose something distinctive about our own identity, that grumbling, right? That mumbling, talking to ourselves. And Paul says that they were destroyed by the destroyer. The destroyer is the name of the angel of death. The angel of death. So the road back to Egypt is the road where? To death. There's no going back. Chapter 10, verse 11. These things, all these things happened to them tupikos, as a stamp, a model. They were written down for our nouthesia, to put something in our minds. Us, listen, us upon whom the ends of the ages have converged. Now, I'm going to come back to that phrase at the end of our class today. But I just want to point out that the word nouthesia, where it's used in Greek, is typically associated with parental instruction. Parents place something in the minds of their children. Why? The idea is that if you can place a model in the mind of a child, then you don't have to do what? Punish the child for misbehavior. And that's what Paul is suggesting here. By means of these stories of the wilderness generation, God is placing something in our minds that can guide us so that we don't have to experience what? The punishment. The angel of death, the serpents, the plague. Chapter 10, verse 12. And so, now comes the conclusion. The result of all this, Paul says, let the one who thinks that he stands watch out, lest he fall. So what Paul is suggesting here is that the selfish cravings, the egotism that is involved in desire, eventually results in cocksuredness. Right? The idea that I'm in control of this, right? I can do it. The one who thinks that he stands, right? The text is speaking directly to me here. In my own craving for academic recognition, right? For positive book reviews, appointments as an editor of book series, in my craving for that. In March of this year, I published my 10th book. And wouldn't you think that would be enough? Right? That was good, but wouldn't you think that would be enough? But now my struggle is with cocksuredness. Right? Now I've published 10 books. I can tell everybody what to think. But I'm a captive to my own cocksuredness and my own desire. I'm going to have to deal with that if I'm going to respond to the others among whom I live here in this city that has been left behind according to Frontline. If I'm going to become more active, I've got to fight off those cravings and I've got to be less cocksure that I have all the answers. Chapter 10, verse 13. Paul says to the Corinthians, no temptation, peirasmos, no test has taken hold of you so far except an entirely human one. Anthropinos. So you haven't been tested beyond your human ability to bear it. And the tests, the temptations with which you're struggling are all human, all too human. But, Paul says, God is faithful. And God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your capacity. And then Paul puts into the Greek text a strong adversative. It's the Greek word Allah. Can you say that with me? Allah. But, on the other hand, and now listen to this, along with the temptation, God will also provide a way out so that you can bear it. Let me comment on two of those words. The word for a way out is the word ekbasis. Ekbasis. Can you say that? Ekbasis. And it means an exit, an escape, an exodus. God will provide a way out. And then, where the English text says, so that you can bear it, the Greek is hupenenkein, and it means to hold up under something. It also means to survive, so that you'll be able to survive and go on. Well, that's the end of the paragraph. And now I think I would like to try to draw out, and maybe you'll help me with this, first, the lessons of the wilderness for us. Number one, the wilderness is a place where we should be disenthralled of Egyptomania. It's a place where we could break the spell, with God's help, of the things that have held us captive to our own cravings. That's the first lesson. The wilderness could be that. When we think about this wilderness time that we're in now, as a church, as a nation, one of the advantages of this sad time might be that we could rip the veil off of some illusions, disenthrall ourselves. Number two, second lesson. The wilderness is a place where we learn that our bondage, our limitations, the constraints that hold us back, come from our own desires. Ultimately, our own cravings. Third lesson. The wilderness is a place where we learn that our selfishness is ultimately a refusal, it's a turning away from God, from others, from the big other. All around us is this wonderful world that God provides. Even now, the last part of September, my wife and I went to our little spot in the community garden yesterday, and the big old lima beans were just falling off of the plants. The most beautiful red and white lima beans, right? Even now, the arugula is still growing like crazy. And the scarlet runner beans from Monticello are still ripening on the vine. Our selfishness is ultimately a turning away from a gracious God. And finally, the wilderness is a place where we might begin to grow up. Our cravings infantilize us. They keep us in a baby state. But God is like a parent who wants us to grow up. Okay, let me end my part of this and invite you to respond by coming back to Paul's conviction that this story, the story of our ancestors, the wilderness generation, is for this moment. For us in this moment. Here's Paul's way of putting it. We are the ones upon whom the ends of the ages have what? Converged. He believes that. That this story is for us, for this moment. So I want to invite you to think with me for a few minutes about two things in our moment. Number one, what are the things of which we need to disenthrall ourselves if we're going to be free and active to help others? And number two, where is the ekbasis, the way out, the escape that God is providing? Now, to get us started talking about that, I want to share with you that I struggled early this morning to get beyond the obvious and the superficial in thinking about the things of which we need to disenthrall ourselves. I mean, some things came to me immediately, but they were so superficial and obvious. So there's a new Alfa Romeo. Julia, I think it's called. And the TV ad, the voiceover on the ad is a very seductive female voice. Yeah, so that's obvious. I need to disenthrall myself. I'm never going to drive anything more than the smallest and cheapest Ford. It's already got 95,000 miles on it. But if I'm going to be helpful to others, I have to disenthrall myself. And I thought of some other obvious things. But then a friend who I consulted said to me that most of us, at this moment in our human journey, are enthralled by, we are captive to our email and the internet and all the allures, temptations. So how many of you get up in the morning and the first thing you do is what? Log on and check that email. Why? Why do we do that to ourselves, right? Why are we captive to, what is it that's ultimately underneath it? What craving is driving that bondage, that addiction? And for me, it's getting worse. You know, for a while, I would just wait until I woke up and I would come down to my study and would check the email on my laptop. But now, guess what I do? I take the phone to bed with me. And if I wake up in the night because my craving has led me to have a bratwurst, one too many, guess what I do? I check that damn cell phone to see what email may have come in. And in my own attempt to analyze what's going on here, what came back into my mind is one of the most beautiful poems by a 13th century Sufi mystic, an Islamic scholar who was in dialogue with Christians in Turkey. His name is what? Anybody? Rumi. Do you know the poetry of Rumi? Here's my favorite poem by Rumi. Listen. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty. and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Do you like that as much as I do? Today, like every other day, we wake up what? Empty and frightened. So, I don't know if Rumi had been reading 1 Corinthians 10. Right? It sounds like he had. We wake up with these cravings, right? We are afraid that our lives might be empty, that we need to fill them. We need to fill them. We need to add something more, some excess to ourselves. The beautiful clouds in the morning sunrise are not enough for us. And the sound of the cardinals at the feeder outside the window. We wake up empty and frightened, afraid that somehow we might slip from public attention if we don't publish an 11th book. You know, one of the things I do on that damn phone is that I actually Google myself. I actually Google LL Welborn. I did it when I was on Highway 80 driving back from New York on Friday night, putting my own life at risk, right? I'm going to be destroyed by the destroyer. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. That musical instrument, I think, for Rumi is just a symbol of something that we love, something that's beautiful, something that is right there on the wall or beside the bed. Pick that up and begin to play. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are thousands, hundreds of ways to kneel down and what? Kiss the ground. There are hundreds of things for which we could give thanks rather than pursuing cravings. Well, those are the lessons of the wilderness for me. And let me come back to my question for you. We have a few minutes, 5 minutes. Can you think with me about the things from which we should disenthrall ourselves? And then the question that we've not yet answered, where is the ekbasis, the escape, the way out? Where is it for you? What did you say, Nancy?
TV.
TV, that's right. Boy, it sure held me in thrall for a long time. Do you know why? Ultimately, gossip. The cable networks don't really provide news anymore. They provide what? Gossip. The salacious, right? The scandalous. And what craving is that answering? I found myself thinking about this. What craving is that gossip, that rumor mongering, that salacious stuff? Do you know what?
Schadenfreude.
Exactly. Thank you. That's what I concluded too. Schadenfreude. Do you know what that means? We aggrandize ourselves. We experience some pleasure and joy at what? Other people's suffering. We think how much better we are than that person who succumbed to a temptation, or that person who's venal or vulgar. That's exactly what it is. What else?
Politics.
Politics. I agree with you. Politics holds us in thrall. It's addictive, right? And it's us against them. And it keeps us from looking beyond the advantage of our party, right? Or our ideology, looking beyond it to what? The common good. The common good. I'm talking about politics here in the narrow sense, right?
As in partisanship.
Partisanship. The success of one party. I'm not talking about Aristotle's idea of politics as living well, right? That's
Thank you for that
yes,
clarification.
that's different. That's different. Aristotle says that to be a political animal is to try to live well. And for him that means, do you know this Greek word that Aristotle uses? Paul uses it too, the same word. It's the word ta sympheron. Does anybody know what that means, sympheron? It means the mutually advantageous. That's what the common good is. It's what is mutually advantageous, not just for my group.
Like a
But-
symphony.
Right.
Yeah,
All the musical instruments playing together, you get symphony.
that's right. You get a symphony. That's exactly right. Sympheron. What else? What else should we disenthrall ourselves?
Well, this is sort of trite, Larry, but I just find sometimes I'm serving things by updating them, maintaining them, cleaning them, you know,
Exactly.
when the opposite should be true.
Exactly. And I agree. I mean, that's the nature of idolatry, right? We are serving things. And I think what you've said there at the beginning when you said it's trite, I think that's true. The great philosopher, survivor of the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt in New York City, talked about the banality of evil. Right? The banality of it. We can't be disillusioned by the fact that evil isn't always monstrous. Evil is sometimes what? Banal, trivial, trite. And so we become complacent with it. Okay, what about the way out? The ekbasis.
Well, I think it depends on everything. For like television, we don't buy cable.
Thank you. We had a little financial crisis in our family this summer related to the employment of one of our sons. And just at the time when that happened, our all-in-one TV computer that sits in the kitchen, to which we're addicted so that we can watch politics and check our email, guess what happened to that big machine?
Kaboom.
It died.
Oh,
The blue screen of death. And it was the best thing that's ever happened to us. We have discovered a whole new world of Sunday Morning Baroque and You Bet Your Garden and things that actually nourish us and that make us better human beings. Yeah, so that was the best thing that happened this summer was when that TV broke. We didn't replace it. We can't because we have to send the money to California. What else is a way out? Yeah, maybe God provided that way out. That's what Paul said. What else is an ekbasis? A way out. The way out could be, let me submit, if others ought to be the object of our concern, and if the bondage that we are in is selfishness, then the way out might be what? The next person that you meet. It might be just the next person you meet. The person that bumps into you or that you meet just in the course of your life. I think that encourages us to live not only with an openness to others, but also with an attentiveness to this moment, right? To the gift of the person that we happen to encounter in this moment. That person might be the way out.
But think about it from this point of view. You want to get out of whatever you're doing now, and you say, aha, I can go over here and talk to David.
Yes.
And so instead of wanting to sit and listen to Larry Welborn,
Yes,
LL
that's
Welborn,
right.
I want to listen to David.
That's exactly right.
And I'm going to pay more attention. I'm going to pay less attention to you
And more
attention
to
him.
David.
And
I
there are
agree.
so many things out there.
Right.
Pick something.
Right.
And you know, and you're just overwhelmed, and I put that sort of in quotes.
Frank, I agree with that. I think, let me put it this way, what you're suggesting is that a reorientation, the kind of thing that God wants us to grow up into, would have a democratizing effect upon us, right? It would.
Could be.
It could be. And here I'm using democratizing with a small d, not that political party, but in other words, it could lead us to discover gifts, right? Talents, relationships that are in fact given by God to lots of people, not just to that egomaniac Larry Welborn. Okay, I see my time is gone, but I'm very grateful for what you all have shared here today. Can I give you a little homework for next week? There are two versions of what Jesus experienced in the wilderness. There's one in Matthew, and there's one in Luke. Luke chapter 4. We are more familiar with Matthew's version than we are with Luke's. If I can ask you to read both versions for next week, you'll see that the temptations that Jesus endures in the wilderness have a slightly different order in Luke than they do in Matthew. And there's a point to that. There's a point to that. So I'm trying to entice you into thinking about that for next week. Well, thank you all so much for this week.